Well, greetings, everybody. Hope you're doing well today. It's a beautiful day outside. If you see over my shoulder here, there's my telescope there that I talked about one time. It was out on the balcony, but because we had 3 feet of snow the last 2 days, I brought it in just to save it. But anyway, I've been shoveling all day long and yesterday, trying to clear, and branches are broken everywhere. It's just phenomenal, but it's a beautiful sight outside. Well, it's a lovely day. It's a wonderful day to be with God and to learn about Him a little more. The title of our lesson today is Needing a Voice of Love, and we'll talk about that, what that means, and you'll see why it applies as we go along. Before we get started, though, and getting in depth, let's introduce ourselves to the actual what we're talking about here today. And let me ask you a question. It's a personal question, so I hope that you can think about the answer in your life. Have you ever been lonely? Well, I mean, even the word lonely is a sad sound, is it not? I admit that I have. And I'll talk about that in a moment, another story about it. But I have been lonely. And I bet you have too at some points in your life. It's kind of an emotional response to life at some point to where we just have that feeling that comes upon us. Have you ever seen the movie Shrek? Now, Shrek is an animated movie, and it had like 4 or 5 sequels to it. It was so popular. But it's a wonderful movie. I really recommend for you to look at it if you ever get a chance. It's just delightful to watch. But it has some really good life lessons inside of it. Now, the story, if I can refresh you a little bit about what it's all about, it's about an ogre by the name of Shrek, and that's the name of it, and his journey to find friendship and to find love. So in the very beginning episode, and when he's living in a swamp by himself, and he's living there, just doesn't like anybody, doesn't want him around, he encounters a talking donkey. And this donkey is hilarious. You got to listen to him talk. He never stops talking. But anyway, he and Shrek started to bond and become friends. So finally, the donkey, in a very serious moment, looks at Shrek and said, Shrek, let me ask you a question. Why do you live here in this swamp? Why do you chase people away that want to see you? Why are you so mean to everybody? And then Shrek makes a very profound response. And let me read it to you. They judge me before they even know me. That's why I'm better off alone. Isn't that great? I mean, that's so, and it's sad just to hear that. So what does that mean to us in this context? Is being with people a solution to our loneliness? Is being married or having a special someone in our life a remedy for that? Is it to have lots of friends all around us is a sure cure for that kind of feeling that we might feel about loneliness? Is being alone the same as loneliness? And we'll talk about that more in depth. But to really point out how lonely people can be, the great Christian writer and lecturer Charles Swindoll, he wrote a lot of great books. I recommend him to you. And he mentioned in one of his talks about an ad placed in a Kansas newspaper that read this. This ad did. I will listen to you talk for 30 minutes without comment for $5. Now, Swindoll goes on to say, it sounds like a hoax, does it not? But the person was serious. Now, did anybody call? You bet they called. It wasn't long before this individual, were receiving 10 to 20 calls a day. The pain of loneliness was so sharp that some were willing to try anything for a half an hour of companionship. That is so sad, but it's so part of our today's life. Now, I want to share with you to kind of give you how I can identify with this, that maybe you can share your own stories in your own mind about something I have shared with you before. You may not have remembered it. You probably dozed last time I told her or something. But let me share with you again because it's very important to my life. I was deployed to Afghanistan to a combat for a year. Now, during that year, I was by myself there, being the senior chaplain over all of Afghanistan to all the American and foreign and NATO forces there. And my family remained in Italy, my 2 sons and my wife. While I was there, my wife and 2 sons had to move back to United States, to Texas to be precise, because of an emergency issue. And so they left the home there. So I had to move all the stuff for them and everything else, wherever it may be. So my time finally came after a year that I was able to go back home, which is Italy. As I got on the plane, as we flew over the Mediterranean and arrived in Italy, buses picked us up and we were transported. They told us as we were going that we're going to the gymnasium on post where all of our families were there to greet us. But can you imagine how I felt? I mean, I remember so vividly looking out the window and just feeling so lonely that I had no one to greet me. And I was hurting. I was deeply, deeply hurting because I had been the chaplain for everybody else. And now I was by myself, even though I was on a busload of soldiers, I was by myself because I had not been taken care of by someone else toward me. And I remember going into that gym, and I didn't want to go in, but that's where everybody went. So I went in to celebrate with everybody else as they met their family, then see a few friends maybe that were there to see me. And to my astonishment, my older son, Patrick, had flown back over just to be there. So when I arrived, that he could greet me when I got off the plane. That was such a thrill to have him there. Well, after a period of time, he stayed for a little while. Then he went back to the United States. And they gave me an apartment off post that I could live in while I had to live somewhere because my house, I gave it up on post, so I had to live by myself. So they gave me an apartment. And I remember being in that apartment by myself. And there was no noise. There was nobody to talk to. I was in Italian area. You know, I did speak Italian. It didn't make a difference anyway. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I was just hurting deeply inside. And I remember so vividly. I remember just looking out the windows. And I remember pacing throughout the house. And I was hurting so deeply, felt so alone there by myself that there was no one to talk to. There was no one I could do. Everybody was uniting with their families, but I had no one. I know it sounds awful desperate the way I'm talking, but I'm reliving that feeling in me. So finally I got down to a point. I couldn't read anything. Nothing interested me. And I was by myself so much there in that apartment. I had nowhere to go. And so finally I just got to a point where I said, okay, enough's enough. And I picked a moment where I just fell down on my knees at the couch. I will never forget this. And I just started crying. And I just reached out to God. And I needed to encounter God. And I just let all that pain out. And I let the feeling of loneliness out. And I was desperate. And I was seeking my master. I wanted to touch his robe, if I could use a biblical illustration. And I was just yearning for somebody like him to encounter me. And I was demanding from him. I want to know why. I want to know why I was going through that. All these questions were coming at me. And I was in a ferocious dialogue with him, waiting for an answer, whatever it may be. Well, to make a long story short, there came a time after weeks of doing this, that I finally started slowly, the pain started easing in me. And the feeling of being with the Lord started getting stronger within me. And I knew that he was there with me. I felt his presence, that he was not abandoning me. And all of a sudden, that moment of isolation became a solitude time with the Lord, like in the Garden of Eden moment, just kind of walking. Like that song, In the Garden, that's what that reminds me of. I was just in a garden with him, and he was ministering to me. I was able to strengthen my soul up and to patch myself together again in order to go forward and still take care of what I need to do in my life. Now, loneliness is not the same as solitude. Loneliness is marked by feelings of isolation like I felt, despite wanting social connections. It's often perceived as an involuntary separation, rejection maybe, or abandonment by others who just push us away or just ignore us. Solitude, on the other hand, is a voluntary moment. It's a time you want to be alone and you need to replenish your soul and your spirit. So people who enjoy spending time by themselves continue to maintain a very positive social relationship that they can return to when they really crave connections again. They can just go right back to it. They still spend time with others, but these interactions are balanced with periods of time alone. At times, this is good for us in our lives. There are times we just need to be away from everybody because we just want to have time to ourselves to think, to pray, to meditate, to find who we are, to find out where we want to go, whatever may be the reasons, but we seek that solitude time. Mandy Hale, a neat author, said this: a season of loneliness and isolation is when the caterpillar gets its wings. So remember next time you feel alone. It's when a caterpillar gets its wings. It goes into cocoon. Remember? Solitude. And then it gets its wings. Jesus had a great example of this solitude in the book of John when he said, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself, voluntarily removing himself in order to be able to be by himself. But solitude on the mountain, as we have said, is not the same as loneliness. Mother Teresa reflected on the hurt of loneliness when she said, the most terrible poverty is loneliness and the feeling of being unloved. The terriblest poverty is that. Loneliness is not being lonesome. Lonesome, for example, is when we miss a loved one or a close friend who's been gone from us temporarily and we kind of miss their presence, but we know that they'll be back. It's not isolation. We can be lonely in a crowd. One person said this: a city is a place where hundreds of people are lonely together. Isn't that the truth? You'll find lonely people in a church, in restaurants, and movie theaters, and even big crowds. A lot of places like that. Loneliness is an inward feeling that we are unneeded, uncared for, unwanted, and unnoticed. Boy, that sounds terrible, does it not? But we've all felt it. Psalms 102 says, I lie awake, said David, lonely as a solitary bird. A bird with no flock, no companionship. I lie alone. So loneliness is a state of mind linked to wanting human contact, but feeling alone. Anyway, people can be alone and not feel lonely, or they have contact with people and still experience feelings of isolation. Loneliness causes people to feel empty and alone and unwanted. And lonely people crave human contact, but their state of mind makes it more difficult to form connection with other people. They want it, but they can't seem to reach out to people. For example, a first-year college student can feel lonely even though they're surrounded by roommates and other students around them. On a very more personal scale, a soldier beginning their military career might feel lonely after being deployed to a foreign country, despite being constantly surrounded by other soldiers right there with him. There's a really funny story I came across about this being alone business. 3 men find themselves stranded on a desert island. So after several years, despite their differences, they became close friends out of necessity. So one day they find an old lamp, and rubbing it, they realized and released a genie that popped out and would grant them one wish. Well, I wish to return to my old life, 2 of the men shouted out together, and disappeared in a puff of smoke. They went away. Well, the third man, who was not as quick as those guys, was sitting there looking around at the empty island and by himself there, and all of a sudden, overcome with the feelings of loneliness, he mutters to himself, boy, I wish I had my friends were here with me. Now, I'm sure after that, they weren't their friends anymore after they came back. But that's kind of what loneliness is all about. When your friends are gone and you're feeling all alone. There's a new government advisory had just made headlines last year by adding a very unexpected major player to health threats, such as smoking, high blood pressure, cancer, COVID-19, things like that. Loneliness, stated the report from Surgeon General, is a widely under-recognized U.S. health crisis. In recent years, about 50% of Americans have experienced loneliness, which comes with a hefty dose of adverse effects. Lonely people run the same mortality risk as people who smoke 15 cigarettes a day. Did you know that? Unbelievable. Institutions that once fostered social connection, such as churches and community-based organizations like Rotary Club or Lions Club, whatever it may be, they're shrinking and disappearing. The civic disintegration, along with COVID-driven remote work boom, is nudging more people into the lonely category. This seems somewhat baffling that something like this can be as threatening as an addiction of global epidemic. But humans are so biologically wired to be social that isolation just wreaks surprising havoc on our systems. People who lack social support have a 29% higher risk of heart disease, 32% higher risk of strokes, and a 26% to 29% risk of premature death just from loneliness. So scientists now know that loneliness can cause a broad swath of human problems. And that may be because our ancestral humans thrived on supportive communities, and anything less can be set off a biochemical stress reaction in our lives. That's how important communication and social interaction and friendships mean to us. So let's get down a little more of what this has to do with our spiritual walk today. So what does the Bible say about loneliness? And it tells about ourselves as well. Well, loneliness is a common struggle. For many, the battle of loneliness draws them closer to God. In fact, like I did when I was in Afghanistan. In fact, drawing closer to God is one of the ways that we battle loneliness, because that brings us closer to the very Creator himself. We are created for connecting. Men and women are created in the image of God. So what do we know about God? We know that relationships is a defining characteristic of God. And as Christians, we worship the three-in-one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And as creatures created in God's image, it's therefore natural that we want to connect with other people. It's natural. Of course, our most crucial connection comes from our relationship to God. We want to be fully known and loved. I want to say that again. We want to be fully known and loved. We might struggle to find love and acceptance and connection with other people, but it's always there with Jesus. It's always available to us no matter what. So I'm going to go through about, 7 or 8 real quick examples from the Bible about loneliness real fast to just kind of get an overshadow of how much loneliness is part of our Bible stories. So many people in the Bible have gone through loneliness, and you're not alone in that. Sorry to say that. You're not alone. There are many people before us have done this. Even persons with great faith have battled loneliness, and their stories are testimonies for us. Well, let's go through. Let's go to lonely Leah, I call it, in Genesis 29. Now, Leah, some people pronounce it, was the first wife of Jacob. Her sister was the second wife. So Leah always felt that her sister was loved more, and she was right. She was. Now, can you imagine the loneliness of competing with your sister for your husband's love and affection? She felt it. Then there's the loneliness of Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis 21. Now, Hagar was the servant of Sarah who bore a son for Abraham, Ishmael. So Sarah's jealousy towards her caused Hagar and her son to be cast out into the desert. She even sat down to die because she and her son were totally alone without help. Now, can you imagine and just put an image in your head the loneliness that she felt for herself and her child? Thrown out when she was just doing what she thought was the right thing and just totally cast out. And God reached down to rescue her. Then we go into the book of Numbers, and we have lonely Miriam. Now, Miriam was the sister of Moses. In her jealousy, she questioned Moses' leadership, and her punishment was to be struck down with leprosy. And when you have a leprosy, you're cast out of your whoever community and your family. And she was thrown out of camp alone for 7 days, living by herself. and Moses and Aaron pleaded to God on her behalf, but she still had to be outside the camp for 7 days before she could be restored. 7 days may not sound long to you until you wonder how much danger she was in, all alone out there, all alone with nothing but the desert around her. It can make us very vulnerable, this loneliness. Let's go to the 1 Kings 17. We've got the loneliness of Elijah. Now, Elijah was called to prophecy against Ahab, the king of Israel, and proclaimed a drought sent by God. Now, of course, immediately afterward, Elijah had to flee for his life because Ahab did not like that. He went into the wilderness where ravens fed him food. Then when the water dried up, God called him even further into exile, all the way to Zarephath. And eventually he ended up in the home of a widow and her son. Elijah did the will of God, and yet he was still an outsider, far from his own home, just wandering around. Let's look at Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, about his loneliness. And he was really kind of a king of loneliness, if I can put that in there. He was a prophet called by God, but he was a lonely calling, known as the weeping prophet. Jeremiah was forbidden to marry and thus had no wife and no children. Called to speak words of repentance, Jeremiah was often rejected by those that he was actually serving, the one he was trying to take care of. So when you're rejected by those you want to serve and to love, the pain is so real, and Jeremiah felt it. Well, we know about the great loneliness of King David. In Psalms 142, it says, "Look to the right and see there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul." Whew, boy, he was down in the bottom, was he not? So David's path to the throne was challenging and was lengthy. He spent time in the wilderness wandering to keep away from King Saul. When he was eventually on the throne, did he still not deal with loneliness? Of course he did. You can be surrounded by people who only want to be kind to you for what it gets them. And he knew that. So even all the wealth and power of a king cannot substitute for the real connection and belonging that we all crave. And he felt it. Then we go to the book of Mark in the New Testament to call the loneliness of the bleeding woman. Oh, what a powerful story this is. Now, can you imagine bleeding for 12 years? This unnamed woman in the Gospel of Mark was sick and had been suffering for such a long time. Her sickness had isolated her from others. She was ceremoniously unclean. So she was put away, sort of like what Miriam was in some ways. But she was put away. She couldn't go to the temple with other women. She could not sit where other people sat, even at home, and they would be unclean to be with her. She could not do anything. She could not go out in public. Others had to know that she was unclean, so she wouldn't touch them because they would stay away from her. And can you imagine 12 long years with no one allowed to touch you or you to touch them? This woman was so desperate for her loneliness to be healed. And can you imagine the courage it had to touch the hem of Jesus' cloak secretly? Can you imagine even greater courage it took to answer Jesus when she said, "But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear, trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth." When we are lonely for so long, it is incredibly hard to reach out and connect with other people because we are doing like ourselves anymore. When this woman overcame her fear, she was healed. Now, let's get back to the real purpose here. Do you ever think that Jesus was lonely? In some sense, he may have been the loneliest human being in this world, in history, which is precisely how Isaiah prophetically described Jesus in Psalm 53. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Now, given who Jesus was, this experience would have been begun decades before his public ministry even begun, which means that Jesus is able to sympathize with your loneliness and my loneliness far more than you previously even thought possibly. In Hebrews chapter 4, it talks about this. So he was already rejected. He was already feeling this loneliness of his role long before he started preaching. So his experience of rejection and sorrow and grief would have begun as soon as he was old enough to comprehend and even communicate. So let's just go a little further into this. But that was all a precursor. There was a supreme moment of loneliness, so dark and deep that only Jesus had ever experienced. It was on the cross, the moment that he became the sin for us. In that unfathomably horrible, incomprehensibly lonely moment, he felt forsaken by his own heavenly Father and all those who loved him. He was ravaged physically and spiritually beyond human semblance, it says in Isaiah. Having spent his earthly life estranged by his sinlessness, now Jesus was estranged by the sin that he bore for our sin. He took on all of our sin himself. And that is a very, I cannot say this even stronger, most grievously lonely moment when you have that all on you and the Father's wrath is upon you. No one has ever experienced or understand the depth of loneliness like Jesus has. So how do we use this understanding of loneliness, even our own loneliness and our spiritual strengths and faith that helps others in Jesus' name? We reach out to those like Jesus did to share the belonging love of God. So from our experiences of loneliness, from all the depths that we've had, like myself, wrestling with God, to find ourselves, to heal our souls back up, we take that wonderful gift of belonging in God's eyes and being forgiven and being healed by him, and we share it with others who are walking in this lonely path around us, right, as we talk today. In our reaching out, we move from our loneliness, possibly, into the solitude with God. Now, here are 3 things real quickly, kind of to sum up our lesson here today. How we can understand and know a person where they are in their life. 3 things that will help you. These are the steps how we can now take the understanding of loneliness, of our own experiences of loneliness, and how we've endured through loneliness, and we have grown through loneliness, and how we can help others. First thing you do is you see others. People have an innate need to feel seen, known, and be heard by others. Have you ever been at a party or a family gathering or maybe even at church, a lot of places, wherever it may be, and find yourself sitting by yourself or standing off to the side on a fringe of conversation and no one's talking with you? We've all been there. It's a terrible feeling, isn't it? The great writer Brooks says this: if you want to know someone well, you have to see the person in front of you as a distinct and never to be repeated individual. So people, we need to see others. When we make others feel seen, we bridge and minimize our differences. And through this, we create those bonds that we're trying to, and people will gravitate, who are lonely will gravitate to us in that sense and seek out that God that we have in our life. The number 2 thing you can do is accompany others. Like a pianist playing outside with a singer maybe. Accompaniment is a merely being around people, being present, showing up for others in their life, particularly when they're experiencing hardship. A time to reach out to them by just being with them. Yeah, it could be through email, it could be a phone call, it could be even better in person, saying, I just came by, I want to see you. I just want to see how you're doing. I have a neighbor who lives close to us right here, who lost his wife about a year ago. And I waited after her death, even though I saw him briefly afterward. And I waited till the family had their time memorial, and friends came by and offered condolences, and then he was left by himself there. And I purposely waited for that moment when I could go over there and be with him in his grieving process. Karen and I also focused on special celebrations in his life, like the anniversary of her death, or maybe Christmas and Easter, whatever it may be, that we would reach out to him in order to say, we have not forgotten you in your grief. We've not forgotten you in your loneliness. The third thing you can do is to value others in sharing. What I mean by that, a great conversation isn't a group of people shouting nonsense opinions. Great conversations, like a song, build over time as each person contributes to the topic. Great conversation yields powerful thoughts. There's not a human on earth who isn't open to sharing their story and how they came to be. So get with someone and let them who are lonely, who are craving that kind of getting out of isolation, and listen to their stories and share your story with them and walk down that path together. Well, let me conclude our lesson here today. One of the great singers I like is Simon and Garfunkel. You may have heard of them. And I really loved them back in the 70s and late 60s. But one of the songs that they wrote that's just really a powerful song is called Sounds of Silence. And I want to just read the first verse to you and let you hear what it says. Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. Do you hear the sound of silence around you when people's hearts are broken? The fear of rejection, maybe. It creates isolation. The feeling that God left them in their suffering. Their cries echo within the silence, and there's no response. Maybe this could be you, or it has been you in the past. So you can't understand, can you not? Jesus is in his loneliness, leaned upon his Father who strengthened him. The loneliness that you feel is actually an opportunity to reconnect with others and reconnect back with you in your own purpose. We can turn the silence from loneliness to solitude in the presence of our Lord. First, we start with us, and then with other people. Loneliness, the cry of help, of wanting someone to just listen, to care about us. And God gives that to us, and it's our turn to give others the same. The Lord bless you. I pray for you, I love you, and I think about you. You're never alone in my